The funeral. With no headlines, but 600 truckers showed up. Welcome to our storytelling channel, where every mile holds a memory and every voice matters. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your presence here means everything. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and tap the notification bell, because tomorrow's story might be the one that stays with you forever. Until then, stay safe, stay kind, and keep the stories rolling. Frank Mallory wasn't famous. He never trended online, never made headlines, and never asked for attention. But if you were a trucker anywhere between the Rockies and the Gulf, chances are you'd heard of him. Old Man Frank, some called him Uncle Frank to others. Not because he was old, but because he carried himself like someone who had seen everything and still chose to be kind. He wasn't loud, he wasn't fast, but he showed up every time with a steady hand and a warm nod. Frank had been on the road for 36 years. 36. Long enough to watch highways change, rest stops close down, and CB radios get replaced by smartphones. But he kept going, not because he had to, but because stopping meant remembering. And remembering was the one thing Frank didn't want to do too often. He drove a weathered Freightliner with a dent in the side and a dream catcher hanging from the rearview mirror. On the dash, taped down with old Scotch tape, was a photo, worn and faded, of a smiling woman and a little girl. Karen and Lily, his wife and daughter, gone now, taken by a drunk driver on a rainy December night 20 years ago. Frank had been on a delivery in New Mexico that night. He didn't make it home in time. Since then, the road had been his only home. He didn't talk much about what happened, but every driver who ever met him remembered one thing. He always left a little, something behind. A cup of hot soup to a rookie broken down on the shoulder. A set of extra gloves to a guy hauling through the Midwest in a storm. A quiet, drive safe, son, spoken like a prayer more than advice. He didn't post online. He didn't need followers. But everyone who crossed his path walked away a little warmer. That December, Frank was on what he told dispatch would be his last cross-country trip before retirement. From Oregon to Georgia, just one more run, one more notebook entry, one more goodbye to the open road. He stopped at a small rest station in Idaho, just off I-15. It was quiet, snow falling in gentle sheets. He got a cup of black coffee, leaned on the counter, and chatted briefly with the attendant, a young man who would later say he just looked peaceful. Frank went back to his cab, pulled out his worn leather logbook, and scribbled a few lines in blue ink. December 8th. Delivered on time. Cold out here, but the quiet's not so bad. Karen, Lily, if you can hear me, I'm coming home. No. One saw him again that night. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the frost-covered lot, Frank was still sitting there, in the driver's seat, eyes closed, hand resting on the logbook. He had driven his last mile, but his story was just beginning. The morning Frank Mallory passed, the world didn't stop. The snow still fell. The trucks still rumbled down the interstate. People filled up gas tanks, bought snacks, made calls, and moved on. But something hung in the air at that little rest stop in Idaho, something heavy. The attendant, Jason, a 24-year-old working the early shift, was the first to notice. He'd seen Frank the night before, smiling gently, sipping coffee like it was the last warm thing he'd ever tasted. There'd been something final in his stillness, something sacred. Jason knocked on the truck window, at first lightly, then harder. No response. When he opened the door and saw Frank slumped back, peaceful, logbook still resting on his lap, he stepped back instinctively, not out of fear, but reverence. Like he'd just entered a chapel. The police were called. An ambulance arrived, but no sirens blared. There was no need. Frank was already gone. The officers found no signs of distress, no struggle, just warmth still lingering in the cab, like Frank had left a part of himself behind for one final ride. But it was the notebook that got to them most. Inside, pressed between the last few pages, were mementos: an old motel key card, a dried flower, a receipt from a roadside diner dated December 1999. And then that final note. I'm coming home. Word spread faster than anyone expected. A trooper shared the story in a private truckers' Facebook group. One post turned into thousands. Truckers from all over the country began commenting. Frank helped me fix a flat in Wyoming. He shared his last meal with me in Kansas during a snowstorm. He gave my kid a toy truck at a way station when I had nothing to give for Christmas. The stories poured in, like breadcrumbs from a life well lived, quiet acts of kindness that no one had tallied until now. Within 24 hours, something extraordinary happened. Drivers started changing their routes to pay tribute. By sunrise on the third day, over 300 rigs lined the shoulder of I-15 near the rest stop where Frank had passed. They parked in silence, headlights off. Some left notes. Others placed small tokens, a coin, a patch, a pair of gloves, on the ground by his last stop. And at exactly 9 a.m., every truck sounded its horn. One long, unified note. Not of sorrow, but of respect. Jason stood nearby, watching through tear-blurred eyes. He'd only spoken to Frank once, but now he understood. This man wasn't just a trucker. He was a thread in the fabric of the road. A soul stitched into the seams of America's highways. No news cameras came. No headlines ran on the evening broadcasts. But to those who drive through the night, who keep the country moving in silence, Frank Mallory's final stop became something of legend. A reminder that sometimes the loudest goodbyes are the ones given in complete stillness. They held the funeral 5 days later in a small town in Wyoming. Neutral ground, they said, somewhere close to the places Frank used to stop the most. It wasn't fancy, no marble pillars or stained glass. Just a modest service at a roadside chapel, tucked between a grain silo and a diesel mechanic shop. But what it lacked in grandeur, it made up for in soul. They expected maybe a dozen people, some local drivers, a few retired dispatchers. What happened instead was something no one could have predicted. Word had gotten out. By 7 a.m. that morning, trucks were rolling in from every direction. Kenworths, Volvos, Peterbilts. Some carried freight, others came empty, just for the ceremony. Rigs from Texas, Michigan, Oregon, even Canada. They lined the fields and back roads like a convoy of silent giants paying their respects. The chapel only had 30 seats. Outside, over 600 drivers stood in the cold, arms crossed, hats off, boots planted firm in the snow. Some had only met Frank once. Others had only heard of him. But they were all there for the same reason. Because in a world that often forgets the quiet ones, Frank Mallory had mattered. Inside, at the front of the chapel, sat a small wooden table, not a casket, but Frank's well-worn logbook, open to the final page. Beside it, a faded photograph of Karen and Lily, smiling as if frozen in time. A note beneath read, "He never stopped driving, but now he's finally home." The only speaker that day was a man named Curtis Blake, a fellow trucker who'd once been stranded in Nevada during a blackout. Frank had given him fuel, dinner, and a place to sleep in the cab. Curtis stood before the crowd, holding back tears. Frank didn't care about glory. He didn't need recognition. He believed in showing up, in leaving people better than he found them. And Lord knows, he left me better. As he finished, Curtis stepped down and placed a single glove on the logbook, a symbol every driver understood. Not a goodbye, but a thank you. Then, without cue or announcement, the crowd outside began to move. One by one, each driver placed something beside the logbook. A patch, a lanyard, a worn keychain, a handwritten note, a child's drawing. Memories, left by strangers who had once been saved by a moment of Frank's kindness. And at exactly 9 a.m., just like at the rest stop, the horns began to sound. One long, low blast that seemed to shake the earth and sky. Some drivers saluted. Others bowed their heads. But all of them knew they weren't just mourning a man. They were honoring a legacy written not in fame or fortune but in fuel receipts, cracked mirrors, and lives touched on long, lonely roads. Frank Mallory didn't die in silence. He was carried home by the roar of his brothers. Among the sea of truckers who stood in the snow that morning, there was one face no one recognized. His name was Eli Granger, 23 years old, barely a year into his career. He stood in the back, hood up, gloves too thin for the weather, clutching a worn notebook close to his chest. He hadn't known Frank personally, never shared a load, never traded stories at a diner, but he had read everything. It started a week earlier when Eli stumbled across Frank's story in a trucker forum while sitting alone in a rest area in Utah. He had been ready to quit. The job was harder than he thought. Long hours, constant loneliness, and the crushing pressure to prove himself. His savings were gone, his back ached every morning, and worst of all, he felt invisible. Just another rig on the road. Just another number in a spreadsheet. But Frank's story stopped him cold. He read about the final logbook entry, the glove left on the casket, the 600 trucks lined up in the cold, and it stirred something in Eli's gut, something he hadn't felt since he first stepped into a cab. Maybe this job was more than a paycheck. Maybe this road had room for people who carried something deeper: kindness, honor, legacy. So Eli rerouted. He spent his last $100 on fuel and drove 12 straight hours to Wyoming just to stand at that chapel. He didn't know what he expected. Closure, maybe, or clarity. But what he found was community. A family built not by blood, but by blacktop and diesel and grit. After the funeral, while most truckers were heading back to their rigs, Eli lingered. He approached the small wooden table inside the chapel, where the logbook still lay open, surrounded by tokens of respect. He knelt, pulled out his own notebook, and placed it gently beside Frank's. On the first page, in bold handwriting, he wrote, Entry 1. Inspired by a man I never met, but who taught me how to drive with purpose. A few minutes later, an older driver named Don Parsons walked by. He had noticed Eli standing alone earlier. You knew Frank? He asked. Eli shook his head. No, sir, but I think he saved me anyway. Don smiled, eyes glistening. That's what Frank did, quietly. Before Eli left, Don handed him a patch. It was black and gold, embroidered with the words, Roll with Honor, FM. Frank used to give those out, Don said. Only to drivers who showed heart. He never got to give you one, but I think he would have. Eli nodded, clutching the patch like it was a medal. That night, when he climbed back into his cab, he pinned the patch on the dash, right next to a photo of his late grandfather, who'd once driven the same roads. And for the first time in weeks, Eli wasn't running from something. He was driving towards something, a legacy worth earning. 3 years passed. Eli Granger was no longer the uncertain kid standing in the snow, doubting his path. He'd logged over 300,000 miles since that day, in Wyoming, crossed 45 states, battled ice storms, engine failures, and brutal stretches of solitude. But through it all, he carried something with him, Frank Mallory's story. Not just in memory, but in practice. He made it his mission to drive like Frank did, with purpose. He kept extra gloves in his cab. He stopped when others didn't. He checked on rookies, handed out sandwiches, helped lift a broken trailer off a shoulder in Kansas during a thunderstorm. And whenever someone thanked him, he'd smile and say, Someone did it for me once. But it wasn't until a stormy night in Kentucky that everything came full circle. Eli was pushing eastbound on I-64 when the rain came down like hammers. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. He slowed to a crawl, his wipers fighting to keep up when he spotted a flickering light on the shoulder, a disabled rig, flashers barely working. Without hesitation, he pulled over. Inside the cab was a young woman, shaking, panicked on her first solo run. Her name was Marla. Her CB was dead. She had no cell signal, no tools, and didn't know how to check the airlines that had frozen. Eli didn't just fix it. He stayed. He walked her through every step, made sure her engine turned over, and followed behind her to the next truck stop where she could safely rest. As they parked side by side, she looked at him and said, You didn't have to do all that. Eli shrugged, pulling a worn patch from his glove compartment, the last one he had. It was black and gold, embroidered with the words, "Roll with Honor, FM." He handed it to her. "I did it because someone once did it for me." She held, like it was treasure, unsure what to say. Eli didn't wait for a thank you. He just nodded, walked back to his cab, and closed the door. Later that night, in the dim glow of his dashboard lights, he opened his own logbook. On the last page, beneath the miles logged and cargo weights, he wrote, March 14th. Helped a new driver tonight. Left her with the patch. Wherever you are, Frank, I hope I'm making you proud. And as the rain eased and the clouds began to part, Eli turned on his radio. A quiet voice crackled through the speaker. Another driver somewhere. Out there signing off with "Keep it steady, brothers. This one's for Frank." Eli smiled, because Frank Mallory wasn't just a man anymore. He was a legend, a road-born spirit passed from one rig to another, through acts of kindness, moments of grace, and the soft echo of a diesel engine rolling into the night. And as long as someone like Eli kept driving, Frank would never truly be gone. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you knew, or a moment that changed you on the road, we'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and share where you're watching from, or tell us, have you ever met a Frank in your life? Someone whose quiet kindness stayed with you long after they were gone. Maybe you have been that person for someone else without even realizing it. Stories like Frank's and Eli's aren't just fiction. They reflect the heart of real people who keep this country moving, mile after mile, often unseen, often unthanked. But not forgotten. Your voice matters here. We read every comment. We want this channel to be more than storytelling. We want it to be a place where real people connect, remember, and reflect. So tell us, what part of this story stuck with you the most? And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because tomorrow, we're sharing another powerful tale that might just stay with you forever. Until then, keep rolling, stay safe, and never underestimate the legacy of a single kind act.